Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to introduce Professor Markus Christen from the University of Zurich. He is a research group leader at the Institute of Biomedical Ethics and managing director of the Digital Society Initiative. And he will give us a lecture on neuroscientific research in the EU ethical legal framework. So please, I leave you the stage. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for this nice introduction. I have been told, I heard that you are lawyers or have mostly the background, so I don't have to talk too much about that because I'm not a lawyer. However, I will talk about neuroscientific, so certainly this is obviously something that might not be kind of the core knowledge of you have. I talk about research and research ethics and about frameworks related to that. So that's kind of the outline of that talk, and as you will see, we have this kind of introduction part where we're going to talk about neuroscience, about neuroethics, and about research ethics, and these things are obviously related. Then we have a little bit a task for you guys, which is we can call a group work, but actually the group is very small, so we're going to have an individual work where you're going to have small research projects, and you have to think about whether you think this is ethical or not. And then we're going to talk about this framework in basically also again three elements. One of them is kind of a bit very introductory idea about how this regulatory framework look like. Another one relates then to one case study, which is one of the biggest ongoing research projects on the EU level on neuroscience, which is the Human Brain Project. I'm actually involved to some degree there because there's an ethics advisory board. So we are not paid by the study, but our task is to advise them. And so I can give you some insights about how that works. And then the last point refers to something that is quite a recent development, which refers to the degree how neuroscience is actually kind of invading other fields, in particular psychiatry. So more and more psychiatric diseases are now reconceptualized in neuroscientific terms. This needs a lot of data. This data might be sensitive, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that means with respect to creating a framework. As you know, many things are changing related to data management, data ethics, data law. Also in Europe, we have about 2 months away where EU General Data Protection regulation will come into force on the whole EU level. That also concerns Switzerland, where I'm from, because we also adapt our law based on this framework. So I think this shows you a little bit how important these things are. Okay, let's go to this first part and ask ourselves, so what is neuroscience? If you want to have a one-sentence answer to that question, then you might take this one from Eric Kandel. He's a Nobel Prize winner in neuroscience. He worked actually on snails. It just tells you a little bit how diverse this field actually is. And this one sentence, the task of neuroscience or neuroscience is to explain behavior in terms of activities of the brain, captures quite what the whole idea of neuroscience is. By behavior, actually, that involves a lot of very high conscious behaviors or thinking of even us humans as well. But even if we make some cognition tasks, we might end up talking about them, and that's also kind of a behavior. But if you then have a little bit of a closer look, then it gets messy. You know, this is kind of a list of disciplines that can be attributed to neuroscience, alphabetically ordered. I'm not even claiming that it's complete, but it gives you a little bit idea about what all the people are doing. So starting with affective neuroscience, people are looking at emotions and how they kind of are built in the brain. Behavioral neuroscience might be closest to this one, but these are mostly people doing animal studies and looking, okay, what types of behavior is correlated with types of activities in the brain. You have cellular neuroscience, which are the people who are just looking at the cells, at the neurons and the glia cells and all the other things that are around there in brains. We have clinical neuroscience, or you could call it neurology, which are actually the doctors that deal with all the types of diseases the neural system can have. You have cognitive neuroscience, which are the people who look more about things about memory, executive functions, these types of things. You have computational neuroscience, which are actually not doing really stuff in brains, but trying to rebuild things in computers to understand how neural systems, for example, process information. You have something like cultural neuroscience, which looks at the interrelation between how cultures shape brains and vice versa. There are many famous studies. One of them is, for example, a study that looked at the brains of London taxi drivers. And as you might know, that the London street system is really complex, and they have a huge hippocampus, which is responsible for learning all these streets, and much bigger than the normal people, which basically outlines that culture affects the way brains are built. Development neuroscience are people that are looking on how actually in the individual person a brain is built up. We know, for example, that there are critical phases in development of people, of babies, when they grow up, when you are doing nasty things to them, the brain will be built in a way that they will have problems for the rest of their lives. Molecular neuroscience are people who are looking at the molecules, at the things that happen at synapses and so on. You have neuroengineering, which are really engineers, or people who are, for example, trying to build robots in a way that the control system resemble what is happening in real brains. You have neuroimaging, which is kind of this part that creates all these nice pictures you're going to see in media and so on, which is an important part to really understand what's going on in brains. The neuroinformatics people are those who are dealing with the data that is created in this endeavor, which can be a lot of data. I'm going to tell you about that more. You have the neurolinguistics who look at the interrelation between neuroscience and brains. Neurophysiology who look at the things how action potential, for example, work. You have neurosurgery, how those people who are cut into brains and take pieces out or put stimulators there. You have paleoneurology, which are people who are looking at bones of extinct species in order to see what it tells us about brains of many, many decades ago. We have social neuroscience, which has become quite a strong field in the last few decades, those are the people who are looking at how behaviors like aggression, sociality, and so on can be explained by the brain, and system neuroscience, that are those people who are looking at the whole kind of system, how these parts of the brain are interaction, how this tells us how behavior is created. By the way, you please just interrupt me whenever you have a question or something is unclear. So don't worry, this is just to show you that neuroscience is actually a huge field, and that actually means that with respect to what we can expect for ethical and legal questions, we have to actually cover a lot of different things. Just to give you an idea, I think one way to capture this complexity is, we can call it a scale view. Just to give you an idea what that means is, you can, for example, think about so-called spatial scales. So when we talk about neuroscience, then we are talking about people who are working starting somewhere in the nanometers part up to the meters part, which are us and our bodies. And up here you see proteins, you see chromosomes, synapses and cells, microcircuits, which are the way how small cell groups are combined in order to trigger things like behavior and cognition. You have brain regions, whole brains, and so on. So you see everywhere you have actually people working on that. And one of the big endeavors today is how you bring all that together into one single picture. So the so-called Human Brain Project, which we're going to discuss later as kind of a case study, is trying to do that. It's trying to think about ways and tools and thinking modes in order that all these things can come together. Another way to look at scales is timing. You know, there are things that happen at the picosecond level, which is 10 minus 12. So it's really, really fast. These are the molecules when they are interact up to years, which is what happens when we are in a cultural environment and our brains are shaped by that. Again, there are a lot of things, a lot of different people working on those things. So if you look at, when you look at synapses, you might have heard about that. The synapses are connecting neurons with one another. You have actual chemical stuff that goes from one part to the other, which is in the nanosecond order. You have things like action potential, which are kind of so-called spikes, we call them, that go from one neuron to the other. in the microsecond level, and so on, metabolism, so-called synaptic plasticity, forming of new synapses, learning, behavior, and up to development and aging. And the last thing to keep in mind is actually a fascinating thing. It concerns here what is the energy used to make computation. And this is kind of the idea how much a single computational step is using as energy. And we don't have to be too precise there, but there's just one thing to keep in mind. And this is really amazing if you would think as an engineer from that point of view, is how efficient brains are in doing computation. The amount of energy they use is so much less compared to all these huge computers that you might know if you really want to do, let's say if you want to mine bitcoins, you're going to place the servers in Iceland because the electricity is cheap and it's cold, so the energy of cooling all these systems is not too big. So it's just amazing how few energy these things are using in our heads. So this just gives you an idea of the complexity of the field. And if you want to end up this very brief introduction to neuroscience, I just want to give you a quick overview on the type of data that actually is involved there. What kind of data can you get? You can get data from genomes. It's obviously clear that as soon as we talk about that, then we are in a field that is much older in terms of biological discussion, for example. I mean, genomes and stuff like that we discussed for decades already. More interesting are then transcriptomes. You see the data stuff gets really complicated to look at. It's actually, but there new interesting things also emerge from the ethics point of view, because transcriptome is basically the way genes are read, and they are a field so-called epigenetics, and we know that, for example, very old dogmas that you believed shouldn't be changed. So like the idea that experience can be reread in the genome actually can happen on the level of the so-called epigenome. So you can make a mother mice really, really depressive, and then the mice of the next 2-3 generations get depressive too, because that kind of gets reread in this so-called transcriptome. You can look at the proteome, which are the types of proteins which are involved there. All these things are, if you want to look from a point of view of a neuroscientist, all these things are shaping the ways neurons are actually formed in the brain. You look at the so-called metabolome, as all these things get really complex, and the graphs even more complex, as you can see. But again, it's basically the idea that on all these levels you can collect data, and all these types of data you want to bring into a single picture. Like looking how synapses work, how cells look like, or even then, which then it becomes even more complex, how cells in small groups are combined with each other in order to perform basic computational steps. All that often requires actually animal experimentation, which is again another field of ethical concern, you might say. We then go into the brain regions part, which is giving these nice pictures you probably have seen in many other kind of publications or newspaper reports, which is something you actually also can do with humans, because it's a non-invasive type of imaging technique. You can look not only about where in the brain things are active when you're thinking or doing stuff, you can also look how the brain itself is connected with each other. This gives, again, another set of very nice pictures. Those pictures may actually tell quite a lot about the way people might behave in certain conditions. So this is obviously something then telling you that, well, it might be an ethical concern what kind of data you get there, how private that data, for example, might be with respect to understanding whether certain people might be criminal, so things like that. Whole brain then, we have then all these pictures that you might have to generate when you unfortunately would have something like a brain tumor or so, but also certainly when you have other types of research that goes on. Then you end up with these types of studies where you want to understand cognition, where you make actual tests. You might record somewhere the EEG signal, for example, or you have also behavior studies with rats or other types of animals, or also even humans. So the point of that very, very brief introduction into neuroscience is actually just to give you two ideas. I mean, first of all, neuroscience is big. It's really a lot of very different things. There is an annual conference of the Society of Neuroscience. I was part of that a few times. That's about 30 to 40,000 people coming together. And then you have these huge halls of thousands of posters, and then you have 2 time slots in order that you exchange your posters. It's just crazy, I mean, whoever can ever overlook that? So it's a complex field. And that means that the variety of ethical and legal issues to be addressed is also complex. So that's kind of the two kind of messages that you can get out of that. So, and who is actually doing then and asking the questions of what are the ethical issues that arise of all that? That is neuroethics. And there are also people trying to define that. And one of them is William Safire, who is actually a person who wrote a lot about neuroscience. He has also a journalist background. And he is basically giving this kind of neuroethics 1, we could call it, definition. So it's the examination what is right and wrong, good and bad about the treatment of, perfection of, or unwelcome invasion of, and worrisome manipulation of the human brain. So this sounds kind of reasonable. It's like, when you're talking about animal ethics, or it's about what can you not do with animals, or about environmental ethics, what can you or can you not do with the environment. This is kind of the idea, okay, neuroethics, what can you or can you not do with brains? That's kind of the intuitive understanding. But there's another one, we can call it neuroethics 2. And this Mikhail Gazzaniga, which actually is a neuroscientist, he gave this kind of definition. Neuroethics reformulates the social questions about disease, normality, death, lifestyle, and philosophy of life, informed by our understanding of the brain. So this goes beyond that. It's not only the idea, okay, they are neuroscientists, they are doing things, and whether it is good or bad, what they are doing is something we have to evaluate. Here, the idea is, okay, what the neuroscientists might find out about ourselves actually might even change the way we understand ethics. So if we then think about how can we connect this brain part and this kind of morality part, there are a few things to keep in mind. First of all, I think the brain, although we understand it as the neuroscientists do, mostly as a so-called biological object. There's actually a piece of meat in your head and you want to find out how that works. It's actually also a cultural object, meaning that what the people understand what brains represent, what brains might actually, whether they could be a model for society or things like that, is also something that shapes the idea of what the brain is, and particularly in the public sphere. We have lived, now we kind of changed a bit. Now everybody's talking about artificial intelligence and all these things. But a decade ago, brain was the big thing. And actually, in the 19th, we had the so-called decade of the brain. Some of you might remember that or have heard that, where the American government has put a lot of money into neuroscience research, and a lot has been triggered by that. Morality, on the other hand, is also a kind of a complex thing, obviously. So on the one hand, it's kind of a system of norms and values certain societies uphold for a certain time, and there might be differences with respect to culture. But it also involves an idea, no, there are standards of justification that you should fulfill in order to claim that a certain norm, for example, is justified norm. So it is, we have two complex things here, obviously. And we have just to keep in mind that brains are not just brains. They are built in us as humans. And morality is just not something abstract out there. It's built in societies that actually live along this morality or not, or might change in the course of development of cultural change. So that means when we then now take back about these two ideas of neuroethics, what we have on the one hand is what is often called the so-called ethics of neuroscience, which is kind of the idea that society wants to know towards the people who look at the brain, okay, what can you do, what are you allowed to do, what shouldn't you do, what is a good thing to do, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, you might also think that, okay, given all that knowledge we generate here, what does it mean and tell us about morality? So it's the idea, what is often called the so-called neuroscience of ethics. It's kind of a strange mixture of actually a more empirical discipline, but that cannot really be completely decoupled from normative thinking. So there are, for example, people that want to see whether some findings in neuroscience tells us whether certain normative theories are better or worse, which sounds like a purely normative question. We will not talk about this part too much, but it just gives you the idea that this kind of neuroethics 1, which is kind of the standard understanding of ethical thinking about neuroscience, is kind of embedded in a bigger thing, which we can call neuroethics 2, which also asks the questions, okay, what does all these things, given the fact that the brain seems to be quite important for us, because, well, if the brain is gone, we actually believe people are dead, the whole brain debate. So the knowledge about how the brain works, and given that whenever we think about morality, somehow the brain must be involved, what does it mean? And tell us about that. So that's kind of the very broad picture of neuroethics. Let's do that a little bit more precise, and this is a kind of a way you can map that. You can start up with what we might call, classic bioethical questions, things that bioethicists work on since several decades at least. And you can develop that along two kind of dimensions. So one is more, what does understanding brains implies for ethical questions, and what does actually changing brains imply? So this is again not an exhaustive list of things, but it should give you an idea how you can think about these things. So let's start down here. Obviously you do research, and we have something we're going to talk a little bit more in detail later, something like research ethics, which goes actually back to the fact that having realized what happened before and during World War II with respect to the way people are treated by so-called doctors in the National Socialist regime, but also in Japan and other settings, believes, okay, well, this should never happen again. How can we prevent that? What are the minimal requirements that when you do research with people have to be fulfilled? And that obviously concerns by far not only neuroscience, but a lot of other fields, medicine and so on. You can talk about gene testing. We have seen that before, that genes are important for brains. Actually, I think the current numbers are around 30,000 genes that we have somehow in our genome, and every cell has that, but most of them actually are only used at one specific place, which is the brain. So most of the genes that we have in our genome are used at only one place, which is the brain. So that means that gene testing, although the discussion has been started in quite other fields related to, for example, specific monogenetic diseases like Huntington disease or so on, actually might tell us quite a lot about brains. But we are here still in the kind of classic regime. Or think about another thing that has been a well-developed story, aspects related to justice, which refer to, for example, how do you distribute organs, which are scarce good among people who need them. But also with respect to brain research, it could actually involve things, because some therapies related to brains are expensive. You might, for example, think that we are now in a position, for example, to treat certain brain-related diseases by so-called deep brain stimulation, which means you screw holes here and you put electrodes deep in the brain in order, for example, to treat Parkinson and other diseases. Before that was available, one way to do that is actually that you put lesions into the brain. You destroy a specific part of the brain. Okay, you might say that the first thing sounds better, because it's kind of reversible. But on the other hand, it's quite also complex. It's expensive. You have to wear this device. You have to change batteries and so on. Maybe for the poor, we just make the lesion, things like that. But on the other hand, you could say, okay, if this is the only alternative, what should you do? It's a justice-related problem, which actually also shows up in neuroscience, but in many other fields as well. If we then go more into the brain part, then the data protection part, although it is clear that it is obviously a problem that relates to a lot of other fields, the fact that data that directly relates to the brain might tell a lot about the people makes this kind of a little bit more and stronger problem. Because if you would, for example, be at some level able to kind of predict based on a certain brain image whether you have certain asocial tendencies, and you might be asked, 10 years ago to participate in a study, and the people even didn't know that you can actually read this out of the data. You have been participating in a completely other study. They made scans of your brains, but later this data might tell us much more. So we have issues of data protection. We have issues of informed consent, given that by brain research, you might actually find out what are the conditions, the neural conditions you have to fulfill in order to really give informed consent, that you can say, no, this person is not really manipulated. He was really saying yes or no. You might also think that stem cells, which is also a field that relates to a long history of ethical debate, we are also doing some research. Within neuroscience, there has been a research strain, for example, with respect to treating Parkinson's disease that involves stem cells. So meaning that you put actual stem cells into the brain and you hope that you can regenerate certain parts that die in the process of Parkinson's disease. You might think, okay, what does it mean? You have all the cells in the brain. Brain death is another kind of more classic, but obviously brain-related ethical issues, and that's a long story, which I don't want to go much into detail, but you might all know that there is a debate, and actually it has been reiterated in just a few years, because some of the ideas that relate to the idea of brain death, whether certain activities are reversible or not, has kind of changed. It also changes with respect to new types of transplantation, so-called non-heart beating donation. So this is a type of donation where you actually do not wait until the brain is dead, but when the heart stops beating and you have a short time window where you can actually get organs from people. And you are also asking, okay, what are the minimal times, for example, you have to wait? Here in Italy, I think you still have to wait 20 minutes until you can do that, which is obviously quite a long time, particularly if you want to get the other stuff. But these are debates that are ongoing. Animal experiments, obviously an issue that relates to everything in bioethical research. But I mean, in neuroscience, the kind of interesting part, if you want to say that, is that if you want to look at so-called higher cognitive functions, probably the only way of doing that involves primates. Because you cannot study higher cognitive functions in cell cultures. You will need kind of highly developed brains. But in the meantime, your research might actually tell you that, well, but we have a highly developed brain and a highly developed primate there, so are you really allowed to do that? So we are obviously kind of, the ethical questions related to animal experiments are kind of on a higher level in a neuroscience setting. Psychosurgery is also an issue that has been very well studied. It's basically the idea by intervening into the brain to change psychiatric conditions of humans. I mean, there have been quite ugly stories if you go back into history, like lobotomy and things like that. But today, we kind of experience a comeback of these types of techniques. Certainly much more precise, And you cannot just say, okay, when we looked at in the 1930s, you are using ice pickles to make these horrible kind of surgeries, if you want to call it then. So you cannot refer back to these times when you look at the really high precision machines you have today. But you still are intervening in brains and the psychotic conditions of persons. Now this is obviously another field of ethical concern. If we then go back more and more into techniques that are really closely related to brain research, and we have again already this neuroimaging research I mentioned before, which is the idea of, okay, looking into people's brain. And there are kind of things that only show up actually in neuroscience. So for example, what do you do if you have a person, you study this person in an experiment, the person believes he's completely healthy, but by doing a scan you see, okay, well, they have an aneurysm. Oh, should we tell them? They didn't come for being informed about these things. So how do you deal with this information? Should you tell the people in advance that, listen, if you take part in our study and if we find something, then we're going to tell you? So should you inform the people about that? Or should we say, no, we will not tell you, or we might ask you later? And all these things are quite tricky questions. Another one refers to neuroprosthesis, so the development of techniques to control devices by your brain. That might be an arm that you have lost. That might be actually people that are so-called locked-in patients. These are patients who cannot control anything. Maybe sometimes they can blink a little bit with their eyes. Here there's research going on that, for example, allows to record brain signals in a way that the people who are locked in start to train their brains in a way so that they can communicate via computer with a third person. Again, this involves several interesting questions. At the end, we might think to start about, okay, what is a normal brain? It is important to, for example, keep in mind that whenever you read stuff in newspapers about new brain research results, the variability of the individual data is high. It's very high. So the types of brains we have, you have, I have, are really very different. So it means that what a normal brain, to say what a normal brain is not so clear at all. You might think about neuroenhancement, and I don't have to talk more about that because you're going to have more people, or you already had some people talking about that. And then you might end up with very basic questions, the more we understand brains, what does it mean about these very old ideas of free will and so on? Are we still responsible? What does it mean for the law? And what does it mean if we are actually using these techniques to make us even better thinkers and all these things? Here we are coming into kind of a philosophical domain where very old questions have been discussed or rediscussed in the focus of neuroethics. So again, just as before, in the whole setting of neuroscience, it doesn't really look better. Neuroethics is also quite messy, very different types of fields, different types of problems there, and the people obviously then specialize in specific things. And later then we're going to look at one aspect that mostly relates to this part, so the use of data and so on, in the second part of this lecture. Okay, now let's go to the third part of the introduction, which is the research ethics part. This is a statement of Louis Frederick Fieseler. I don't know whether you know him. And he makes a statement that you might have heard quite often, And he's saying, you don't know what's coming. That's not my job. So he's a researcher. It's a matter for other people. I was working on a technical problem that was considered urgent. I distinguish between the development of an invention and its use. You can't blame the maker of the gun that killed the president. As you know, there are more than one president killed by guns in the United States. So, what do you believe? What did he invent? Any ideas? What could this person have invented? Any guess? Wild guess? No wild guesses, okay. He invented a substance consisting of the saponification of aluminum salts with naphtha-passing acids and so on. He invented napalm. That's the guy in 1922 who was invented napalm, which was used in flamethrowers and then later in bombs in Vietnam and so on. So obviously, well, in the many ways you can die on battlefields. This is not the nicest way, obviously. And he was saying, okay, I was solving a technical problem. You know, we had to throw flames in a way that you can make it easy and so on. So this kind of brings you to the point what one of the key problems of research ethics is all about. It's not the only one, but it's one of them. If we look at kind of the historical development, how this thinking has evolved, there are a few cornerstones to keep in mind. So one of them goes back quite some time, more than 400 years ago, in a time where the Royal Society has been founded in London. And when these people came together to form this scientific society, actually the first, they made a deal with the king. And the deal was, okay, you can do your science, but you do not interfere in matters of ethics, politics, and religion. So that was the deal. When the scientists were starting to be scientists, the king said, yeah, you can do that, but don't ethics, politics, that's not your business. Don't do anything that interferes with that. If you look at Wilhelm von Humboldt, kind of a famous German person, the idea of the Humboldt University came from him. One quote from him is that only when science is exercised for the sake of science, it really can benefit society. So it actually kind of still in the same picture. You know, it's the idea that science itself is kind of a closed system, and when the people are really doing what scientists should do, then the benefit for society will come by kind of automatically. The third one, this is Fritz Haber. He also received the Nobel Prize for actually a really important invention. He created ammoniac synthesis, which is basically the fact that the nitrogenous in the air can be put back into a chemical. That was not only decisive for building explosives, but the whole fact that we can fertilize plants. I mean, if he wouldn't have made the invention, we would all be dead because of hunger, because we cannot, the global population would not be able to be fed if these things were not invented. And Haber was an interesting guy because he was not only inventing that, he was also inventing poisonous gas during World War I. And his justification was, okay, in peacetime, our job as scientists, that's for the whole mankind. But in war, then we only look for our country. In wartime, for the fatherland. Well, it changes sometimes. And this quote might be an indication for this change. It's Robert Oppenheimer. He's a key person in the so-called Manhattan Project. You might have heard about that. It was the building of the nuclear weapon, partly initiated by Albert Einstein writing a letter to the President of the United States, fearing that the Germans might build a nuclear weapon, and saying, listen, we have to be first. And he was leading this project. And well, I mean, they were successful, as you know. But then he made this: the physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose. So it's actually, so this idea that has been put forward by the Royal Society, okay, that's two different things, kind of comes back. And today, this is the Academy of the Sciences and Humanities in Switzerland, and I assume that your academies have similar kind of statements. So they have written a report about what does it mean to be, as a scientist, to be integral and ethical, and that's what I think is today kind of the common sense with respect to the responsibility of science. It's something like science is accountable for society, for its objectives, actions, and the use of its resources. So we have to show society how we have done things, whether it was good or bad. this freedom of research is okay, but you cannot just claim it. You have to show that you use this freedom responsibly. So this is quite a long and a different way, starting from the Royal Society up to this year. It has obviously several reasons. At that time, in the Royal Society, the reason why this has been said was really a power statement, in the sense, listen, scientists, don't interfere with our power as the persons who make the laws, who decide about religion and so on. And now that has changed. So if you look at this kind of interrelation between science and society, what are the normative types of interrelations that are relevant here? So one of them is that science itself, we can make it in a very short sense, how should science do things? This refers to issues like integrity, research integrity. It can also, science might also say, okay, what should we actually do? You know, what are the things that society wants from us? Society might ask, okay, what are you really allowed to do, what you shouldn't do? And some questions actually, why should science? I mean, although we are now living in a time where we believe, I have to say, where we still believe to some extent that science is kind of guiding the way societies should develop. This is by far not so clear. This might change. Whether for good or bad, that's another question. But the type of expertise and the importance of scientific expertise within the setting of the whole society is not so clear. That means, if we look at this part of the picture, we are in this responsibility of science problem. So it's about what are the boundaries, what are the duties of science towards the society. And this part more reflects something which we call the scientific ethos. So what are the framework of moral behaviors such that science, within science, can say this is good or bad science in an ethical way? If you look at this kind of idea of scientific integrity, this is a document that is also available in English, so I think you get all these slides, so you don't have to make all these notes. And there are three elements in this document. So one of them is that, first of all, science should be truthful and transparent. So it involves things like it's a self-critical attitude. You should not falsificate and manipulate data, and you should communicate what you have found out. You should not hide things that, for example, are zero results. You should disclose your interests in that respect. Second, it's kind of the idea of exemplary unfairness. So it's the idea that, for example, in your lab you should have something like a positive working atmosphere, which maybe is something that not is around in all labs. It should be a fair naming of contributions. It should be not stealing the property of others and ideas of others and things like that. And the third element is actually, and I think this is maybe something that might need more promotion in various settings, is that you should promote the young talent. So you should give the young people the freedom they need in order to find new stuff. And there are various ways where we can probably discuss also at that point to what extent, what are in the current conditions actually hindering this idea of scientific integrity. However, if we then look from the ethics point of view, how can we structure the types of problems we have? There are three elements we can discuss in that respect. We can talk about the object of research, we can talk about the goals of research, and we can talk about the effects of research. Think about the object. I think the key issue there with respect to ethics is, okay, does this object, for example, have some intrinsic value? Is it vulnerable in a specific sense? So, for example, think about children. If you make research with children, obviously the issue of vulnerability is there. You can think about research with prisoners. That again involves different ethical questions that might actually relate to specific ideas societies might actually have towards prisoners. You know, some societies might think, okay, they have sinned, so they are a legitimate object of our research because they have to give something back to society. But others might say, well, they are imprisoned. Although they are imprisoned, you cannot do everything with them, obviously. primates, as discussed before, given the fact that we know more about the way brains, for example, generate complex states and complex behaviors, are we still allowed to do certain stuff with primates that might actually have, for example, some idea about themselves? Obviously, here the goals is a question of legitimate morality itself. So, for example, you can start, okay, what about military research? Maybe it's wrong to say that military per se is evil as such. I mean, we look at the world and we see that sometimes we might need this type of power. But still, it's a question, is napalm in or out? Is inventing napalm in or out in that game? We have things like reproductive cloning, which is one of the few things that is really forbidden globally, that you are not allowed to do. Although people are, as you might have heard just a few weeks ago, about an experiment in China about cloning primates, which could say, okay, are we now nevertheless going into that direction? Or what about doing research with LSD or cocaine? You know, you are using stuff which is forbidden, but you might want to analyze it. When we have, for example, the whole cannabis discussion. As you know, there are now even states in the US who have legalized it because people find out, well, it might be useful for people with cancer. But what about if you want to make research in a time where the substance you want to research is actually forbidden? Or a third element here, the research effects, is an issue of benefits and risks. So things like, okay, sequelae, you do something, but it might have side effects. It might have effect on the environment. You might working with technologies that are risky, radioactive substances, things like that. So this gives you an idea how you could structure ethical concerns related to scientific research. And obviously, also neuroscience would be affected by such a framework. But before now we go to the neuroscience part, I look at our time, we are quite in time actually. We go now to this group work. And how does that work? I have here research projects for you. And, okay, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I also, the poor film guys also have to do it, you know, I'm sorry. So you can just choose one of the research projects. You think a little bit, whether you think that's ethical or not, what could be the problems in that project. And then you will talk and tell to the others why you believe this is a ethically okay or not so okay project and why. And actually the initial idea is that we can scotch it on this here, but I think this will not really work. So we just talk about that, and other just may say, well, I'm disagreeing with you. And then you can, we can have a brief discussion on that. I think we're going to use about 10 minutes for that, not more. So do you believe that a certain project is really, no, that's unproblematic because of blah, 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 or, oh no, that's really problematic because of blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to now go around. I'll let you choose one as well.
Avete qualcosa da fare? Scegliere un piccolo research project, un piccolo progetto di ricerca e dire, leggendo, se è problematico da un punto di vista etico oppure no. Quando il concetto di problema tecnico, la scienza si occupa solo di problema tecnico e la reazione della processa. E invece ci sono dei circoli che parlano molto di relazione di
Just have a 2 minutes, think about it.
lo leggete e adesso c'è un problema etico, ok?
Feedback as well, maybe we can
Anche la nostra, non so se non volete.
They don't want to be feared. They don't want to be. I have to.
Oh, yeah. Just do it now. I have to write down everything. Oh.
Sì, può anche farlo con il signore se vuole oppure con lo
Okay.
Okay, I suggest that we start doing that, and it will be a quick exercise, and there's no definitive answer to that. I just show you how that could be. So I also have one, you know. So my research project is the following. I show to a 4-year-old child a piece of chocolate. So the child is sitting here, I put the chocolate here, and then I say to the children, okay, I go out now, I come back in 5 minutes. If you did not eat that chocolate, you get a second one. And then I go out, and there's a kind of a mirror where I can see what the child is doing, 5 minutes waiting for the chocolate and trying to eat it or not. So do I believe this is an ethical or non-ethical problem? Okay, it's children, obviously. So they might be vulnerable. It's about chocolate. I mean, it's really might be very nasty to let the children wait 5 minutes for not eating the chocolate. But on the other hand, maybe parents are doing that often. So I would say that sounds like something that the experience that is kind of matching the normal experience of the children. It's not really. It will not be punished if it eats chocolate, just doesn't get the second one. So I would probably say that is not so problematic. This is, by the way, a very famous experiment, the marshmallows experiment, that deals about to what extent children are able to control their behavior. And actually, it's really interesting because the people have done that many years ago, and they have followed the people, and they found out those who resisted the urge to eat the chocolate, they were more successful in life later. Now, what is your project?
So my project is within the framework of the EU chemicals regulation, which you carry out the LD50 test for a substance that has been on the market for a long time. But for which no chemical safety report is yet available. Using mice, you determine the lethal dose where 50% of the animals will die.
Okay, what do you think?
There are some problems. It's not completely ethically unproblematic because here you are doing research with animals, so you may arise questions about the ethical consensus of the objection, for instance, of research and doing this kind of research. And there is also the fact that there has not been, till now, any kind of safety report available. So you are kind of using this stuff without having safety reports. That is more ethically problematic.
I would put it somewhere here.
Yeah.
Just one note, I mean, the safety report is that test. I mean, it's an interesting element that this chemical guidelines that have been put in place about 3-4 years ago in the EU, also in the whole Europe framework. And there were a lot of substances used in everyday, they were never tested, you know. But the test is, you might say, well, you have to test and see how much do you have to give to mice in order that half of them die, you know. And you would say, wow, is this really a good test? But the point is that is the standard. And giving the fact that this REACH came into place required to kill a lot of mice, because there were a lot of things not tested. But I think I also would put it somewhere here. What is your project? You.
You cannot speak, non riesce a parlare? Non riesce a parlare perché
okay. No problem. Then your project.
Okay. So, you are recruiting commercial providers of child pornography in the darknet for a survey study with assurance of absolute anonymity. By means of a new questionnaire, you want to determine whether the providers themselves are pedophiles or offer the material primarily for profit reasons. So, I think this is not problematic because we are not provoking people to give more commercial or more pornography, but we are only describing the situation. So we are acting like a journalist. I think this is not a problem.
So it's only describing, because I didn't hear the first part of your...
The first one?
Yeah, what you...
You are recruiting commercial providers of child pornography in the darknet for a survey study with assurance of absolute anonymity. Okay.
So what you are doing is you go to the darknet,
yeah.
You find the people who sell child pornography.
Yeah.
And that's all anonymous, and then you ask them, would you like to take part in the study?
Okay, we are not the police. So.
This is an interesting study because so people from colleagues I work with are in the cybersecurity domain. They look at cybercrime stuff. The fact that they search for this data is itself a crime. You know, so what they require in order to do these types of study is kind of an exempt that makes sure that they will not be punished. Because you might say what you are doing, you are looking actually for people who sell child pornography. And doing that is a crime. But the point is, I mean, that's an interesting point, because the legal situation would require to ensure that you are actually not punished for that study. So it's an interesting type of problem. What is your study?
We are investigating the effectiveness of chemical castration in the treatment of the prisoner of sexual offenders. The prisoners are given the possibility of a reduction in penalties if, after the intervention, a lower risk of offending can be demonstrated based on the diverse psychological tests. And I think that is maybe in the middle between ethically unproblematic and ethically high problematic. Because you give the chance to people which actually are already prisoners. So maybe they feel more the pressure of being in prison, so they're incentivized to do this. Like, if you have the chance to go out of the prison, maybe also doing the castration, you would be, maybe you would do it if you really don't like to stay there. But at the same time, maybe doing this kind of therapy, of intervention, can be useful, especially for sexual offenders, because I think that can be something that maybe we can work on it, but also it's not unproblematic. It's for sure is problematic, but...
Yeah, I think it's a good description of the problem. I mean, we talk about prisoners who are in a special status, and now you give them the chance, listen, we do that to you, but then you might get out.
But at the same time, I was thinking that maybe it would be better if you if you go out of prison, once you understand what you've understood, what you've done, not because you have the chance to do it. So that's also another thing that, I mean, yeah, it's
Okay.
either.
Thank you. What is your question?
Well, I'm conducting an interview study with the dissidents of the Assad regime who have escaped from captivity and received asylum in Italy. And I want to examine the psychological resilience of the victims after torture. But I don't know how I want to examine. There's not set here.
I agree. I mean, there are a lot of things not said, but the idea is the following: you look for people who came here as refugees from the Assad regime, who have been tortured, and you ask them again how it was to be tortured.
If I only ask them, and they will agree, I think it's not ethically problematic. It's, I think it's, if they would agree for that, of course, I cannot see any problem. But of course, if this examination would be more, I don't know, developed, or
Yeah, I agree. That obviously depends heavily on what actually is going on. But
if it would be harmful for them, of course, it's ethically highly problematic. But I cannot say by this.
I mean, but I think I think you made a really important remark. Is it harmful for them to recapitulate what happened to them? And this is obviously would be an important element when you ask them whether you want to participate. You would have to clarify that this is a risk they face, that they might remember things they would like to forget, and this would be potentially harmful. What is your project?
I read for
Okay.
You carry out a study with 1,000 people who have agreed to wear a device for more than 10 months. The device will record every 10 minutes for 30 seconds everything that happens acoustically around the person. The test persons can decide every day which data they want to send to you. She answers in Italian. Do you
Okay,
understand?
yeah, I will not. I will try. I might understand it fine.
Allora, io penso che ci sia un problema etico, ovviamente, perché cioè, viene fatto uno studio su 1000 persone e per un certo periodo di tempo, cioè per 10 minuti, cioè per 30 secondi ogni 10 minuti vengono privati della loro privacy. Quindi in questo caso c'è un problema etico. Però se c'è la seconda parte del testo dice che comunque le persone possono decidere tranquillamente quello che vogliono mandare. In questo caso viene lasciata anche la scelta, quindi la libera scelta alle persone di poter scegliere quello che vogliono mandare oppure no. Quindi c'è un 50-50, presumo, perché alla fine vengono lasciati liberi, però vengono anche privati della loro privacy.
Quindi più o meno lì starebbe a metà, un po' prima della metà. Okay.
Yeah, I think I understand it partly, and I think also an important element of this type of studies that this device will not only record you, it will also record you and the other people around you, which might not know that you are doing that. And the privacy is obviously the other important. So I'm not sure. I suggest that as the time goes on, that you don't have to go to the ethics committee with your research project, but I think the idea of this very short kind of exercise is to give you an idea about the complexity of the issues that can emerge, related to the way you want to approach people, whether this might be legal or not, who is involved in a certain study, and so on. So, and in order to do that, you will need a kind of a framework. And how would this framework look like? If we look at a very basic level, which would be in that case the level of the human rights, the question is, okay, how does it show up? The whole part of science. And actually, science itself is all barely mentioned in the Declaration of the Human Rights. It's in Article 27. which is entitled The Right to Participate in Cultural Life, so science is part of cultural life. Here you find something. So everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts and to share in scientific advancements and its benefits. So that's kind of the only part where science is mentioned. And the second sentence in this Article 27 is then everyone has the right to protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific and so on. So it's kind of a copyright element which is in here. Obviously there's more stuff around. I think the most relevant is that the Council of Europe, which is all European countries, it's not the EU Council, it's the bigger one. They have a Convention of Human Rights in Biomedicine, and this convention covers actually quite a lot. And many of those elements also interfere with neuroscience, but obviously also more broader with all types of medical and intervention. So it concerns the issue of consent, protection of privacy, of the genome, removal of organs. So it's the whole part, relevant part of the biomedical sphere which is covered by this convention. If you want ever in your life then make an ethics assessment, want to submit a Horizon 22 proposal, you have to fill in a self-assessment of ethical issues. And it's amazing to see how this has developed, because the list has grown, and maybe in the next program it will be even a longer list. And it's important because this basically captures all the things that we have discussed so far. So there's one part of elements that refer to this one thing that is really forbidden, whatever has to do with human embryonic stem cells. So you have been asked, does it involve them? Or even the use of embryos, or the use of human fetal tissue cells. It's not saying that this is completely forbidden in every case, but whenever this happens, then you will have to provide good answers for what you want to do. Obviously, this is another issue that comes back to what I've told you before with respect to the Helsinki Declaration, for example. So protection of human participants in research, in particular if you make physical interventions, and then again human cells or tissues, other than. So this is kind of this part. Then the second part, which becomes more and more relevant, relates to the data. So does it involve personal data, collection or processing? Does it involve processing that others have collected, of data that others have collected? Does it involve animals? Obviously another issue. If you are doing that with non-EU countries, are you doing something there that might raise ethical issues? So this is kind of a new element coming out. It's not only about ourselves, but we also want to make our principles relevant in other parts of the world. Is it planned to use local resources? Is it planned to import anything, including personal data, or is it planned to export anything? So it's not only about, again, many of those elements really refer not only to the fact that we have our ethics, but we also want to make our ethics valid in other parts of the world. The third part is, okay, if you are working with people, with countries where poor people live, is there a danger that you exploit them, and how you would counteract that? Could the situation in the country put in those taking part in that in certain risks? That is actually quite a relevant study. Just think if you want to make a study on homosexuality in certain African countries, and that might put these people under risk. Does your research involve the use of elements that might cause harm, so environmental issues come into play? Does your research engage in fauna and flora, so the whole, again, environment aspect? Or causing humans that are directly involved? Does it involve, now another element comes into it, dual use items? So this is quite a complex thing.
We have a lecture on that.
Okay, wonderful, then you have to talk. This is an interesting one. Does it concern regarding exclusive focus on civil applications? We have seen that before, military research, yes, no. Things are changing now. The EU just about a year ago has put the 500 billion euro fund for defense research because they thought, okay, the world has become unsecure, we might need that as well. So it will be interesting how you will deal with this element now. And the last one, the issue of misuse. So what you just see in this self-assessment, that the spectrum of ethical things to be considered, so this framework, has become quite big. And in that sense, I think it's certainly something you can discuss whether it is too much or not. But the point, we obviously realize that kind of a moralization of research is going on, and I personally would say it is for good in the sense that these things, it's not that, if you say yes to one of those, that you can't do your stuff anymore. But that you have to think about how you can, for example, reduce certain risk as much as you can. If you now go to one specific research project, to a really big one, this is the so-called Human Brain Project. Just give you a few background about these things. It's a so-called flagship project that has been started in the so-called Future and Emerging Technologies program. And it's important, this program is a technological program. And you might wonder, why does brain research show up here? Obviously, those who were succeeding with that project were able to rephrase the whole brain or neuroscience as a technological problem, because they were able to get the funds at the end. These programs it's not like other EU programs where some intelligent people come together and say, okay, what do we need, what should we study? But the scientists themselves have decided what they believe should become a flagship. So it's a bottom-up competition. The launch was 5 years ago. Actually, we are kind of in the mid-term now of that project. They are supported for a period of 10 years, which is quite a long time. I mean, usually you might be lucky to get a project for 3 years. But this is 10 years, so it's a long-term orientation. But every few years you get evaluated, and then people might say, okay, now this is a complete failure, we should stop that. So it's kind of not guaranteed. And the initial idea is that the project sum is 1 billion euro, which is a lot, but half of it should come from third parties. So that makes the types of financing kind of unstable, because you're actually not really sure whether you are able to get this on half. So this is kind of the framework of this Human Brain Project. The goals is, so the question is, how did they get the money for a technology project? Okay, they say they want ICT-based brain research. So that involves actually integrating data knowledge. You remind at the beginning these many, many levels, and everywhere people are doing different kind of research. How can you bring that together? The solution they propose, it's kind of ICT will do that. It will get this new understanding, new treatments, and new technologies. So that's kind of the. I think it's important that this element is in as well. A lot of things has been said, saying, okay, we want to simulate the brain in order to understand it. This is an interesting point in this whole debate, because if you look at official documents, this idea is not really being pushed forward. But in the public domain, when you want to sell the projects, this was the kind of the key statement. And that actually put them into troubles. Because a lot of neuroscientists said, listen, this idea is nonsense scientifically. And so that created actually a tension. And this tension was showing up in a remarkable development that in 2014, people, when the project wanted to kick out a whole pillar of research, so the cognitive and systems neuroscience part of it, so that part that is actually closest to classic neuroscience, then the people start to say, well, that you can't do that, So there was an open letter signed by hundreds of scientists saying, okay, this, you cannot do that, we should change governance and approach. And actually it started a process that ended up in changing the program and the governance. It also involves that actually the key person who was pushing this project has been set aside to some extent. So it was quite a conflicting process. We were kind of following that process, the ethics advisor, quite closely. And it's interesting to realize that a lot of ethical issues that emerged in that thing actually did not have to do a lot with all the classic stuff that I have told you all about. It had to do with the governance of the things. And this is yet another interesting point to take into account. It has to do with something you might call big neuroscience. So what is big science? Something like the Manhattan Project is a big science project. So here you had to bring thousands of physicists together at secret places all over the US in order to build an atomic bomb. You have a facility like CERN in Geneva, so the huge particle collider, where also thousands of people work together in systems that generate terabytes of data within seconds. This is, here you have just the fact that this infrastructure, you have to manage that. So this is really something big, and that means that other issues come into account. So big neuroscience is something that we think is the challenge to organize, coordinate, and manage a large number of researchers so that you can really say, okay, what we are doing, the money you are giving us for that, that's fine. We really do stuff that is useful. And you have to do that in a way that ICT, so information computer technology, becomes really a central element in order that you can do that. It's a structure and technology. So what does that mean with respect to structure? There are three big things I would say are relevant here. You have a lot of very different people that should work together. You have a lot of very diverse data that you have to bring together. And you have a lot of money involved, and you have to show that you are using that money. These three big things, I would say, involve both ethical risks and benefits. I think it's important to keep in mind that it involves both. Obviously, if you want to do this big number thing, so bringing together a lot of different people, and you do that in a scientific discipline where the tradition was small labs. Neuroscientific labs are in the order of maybe 10 to 20 persons working together, not 500. So people might just think, well, I don't want to do that in this big thing. I want to keep on with my small stuff. There are actually sociological studies claiming that if you increase the number of scientists working together, the output you get is less. So you might say, even ethically, well, that's a bad investment of money. On the other hand, what you could do is that all the ethical risks that might come up is this type of research. The possibilities to control that and understand that might be better. That would be a benefit. The big data is obviously an issue of security and privacy issues. It's quite challenging, the fact that the way you get informed consent might be different in Sweden compared to Italy, compared to Greece, compared to Netherlands. You might just fail because of the complexity of these regulatory issues. Although this is now changing because of the data protection regulations, the things are more harmonized. But the idea is obviously that when you have a lot more data, you can get more out of it. And you can actually make data sharing kind of a scientific duty. Because in particular in neuroscience, this is a problematic thing. And you can understand why. Because let's say, for example, you make a study where you measure neurons. This is hard. You might use a year 2 years until at the end you finally get your data, because you know the animal might die, you don't get the cells you need, and so many things can go wrong. And so if you put that much work in your data, you probably don't want just to share it and then make the publication out of that. So you have to find ways to deal with that. But the benefit would be that you might actually be able to do that in a way that you get the credibility, but you still get to kind of share it. The money problem is another one. It's an interesting that as soon as a lot of money is involved, you might end up in the too big to fail problem. You know, if the Commission, the European Commission, is giving 1 billion euros to something, will you ever find someone saying, okay, we did a mistake, we just wasted money? This will not happen, you know. This will not happen. I mean, there might happen things behind the scenes, but officially, these projects never fail. And that's a problem, because you might actually then advance things that you know they are wrong, but you cannot admit it. But on the other hand, given that it is so much money, the pressure towards third persons to really show that you do the right thing might also be higher compared to other ones. So this is kind of an interesting kind of tension that shows up here. If we look at the technology part, we have these 4 elements that are relevant here. Just to check time. I might not be able to tell everything, but I think that's okay. We have brains that people study, and we have what I call old processes in neuroscience and new ones. So the old ones is you have brains, you make experiments, and then you get knowledge about these brains. Based on that knowledge, you want to choose what type of model you want to create in order, for example, to understand action potential generations in neurons. And then you look at the real brains, whether your model works or not. And you communicate to the people mostly with press releases. Maybe you have a nice picture even to show, but you are showing text. In this ICT-driven world, things start to change. What you want actually is that the knowledge you get tells you what kind of experiments you should do. The simulations you're going to use tells you how you should structure this knowledge. You can even happen, and that has been shown to some degree in another field where simulation research has become really relevant, which is climate research. That kind of the simulations become the real thing. You know, the people might say, okay, I mean, the simulation, we have put that much work on that and so many million lines of codes and so on. That cannot be wrong, you know. There must be something wrong with the real brain if you don't get the data. Certainly, it's a little bit exaggerated, but the point is that in that setting where you use this huge endeavor of technology, simulation, and experts that actually are computer scientists and maybe not neuroscientists, the way you look at the things might change. The way you communicate even changes. You might now show nice simulations and pictures and movies of something which is kind of purely artificial, which is much more convincing than just the text. So it's important to keep in mind that this technology element has, again, several risks and benefits. It has an issue related to the trust, which kind of relates, for example, to the fact whether you should really trust what the simulation tells you. It has actually benefits. So, for example, if the simulations really work good, you might need less animals, which would be an ethically good thing. With respect to the community of people, what has been observed to some degree in climate research is that what can be called fortress mentality. There's a nice analysis made by a science study person in climate research again, where the old-fashioned meteorologists, you know, those people really go out and look at the weather. They came to the simulation. People say, you don't worry anymore. What's really happening? You just talk about your models, you know, and you don't know how difficult it is to really understand the weather. So it's not the same as climate, all these things. But the point is that when people who are investing a lot of time in order to create these huge models, you don't want to give that up so easily, you know. So this can create these types of fortress mentalities. But on the other hand, it's obviously something that requires interdisciplinary collaboration. So you can turn that into something positive in the sense that you want to bring people to work together in that respect. Scientists from neuroscientists with computer scientists, for example. The issue of truth is an interesting one, and it's a particularly interesting one related to this point. Because you don't know what is the peer review culture with respect to these types of models. You know, if you make an experiment, you write it down, you submit the paper, and then there are all these other experts that look at it and read what you have done and tell you whether the experiment was good or bad and so on. And you get the feedback, you can publish or you cannot publish. But here we are talking about computer programs that have million lines of code. Nobody will ever read them. So how do you make a peer review of these types of research? On the other hand, these types of research can actually give you a better idea of what actually is there on conflicting findings in the body of research that is already there. And the last point to look at is the credibility point. So, for example, if you look at visualizations, you have just to keep in mind that whenever you make a visualization of a simulation in neuroscience, the colors you use, it's completely your choice. I mean, these colors are not there in the brain. You might use those colors that support your story, like a propagandistic thinker, actually. So how do you make sure that you are not putting more into what you want to show, what is actually there? On the other hand, obviously these types of techniques give you purely novel ways to make people understandable what you're actually doing. Maybe it's so hard to read a scientific, even in a newspaper, scientific text, but the video is so great, everybody will understand it. So it is also something that can be used positively. So we are now entering in the last part of it, which is actually not possible anymore because we have reached 4 o'clock, which would be the big data and neuroscience part. But I think this course will be repeated in a year, so then we will more focus on these parts. But I hope, at least, that this outline, which was kind of a general outline telling you what neuroscience is all about, what neuroethics is all about, what research ethics is all about, and then put that a little bit into showing that in a specific example, which is the Human Brain Project, gives you an idea how you can deal with ethical and legal, mostly ethical, less legal stuff, framework when you relate this to neuroscience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Christen, for this broad overview. È stata una lezione molto densa, mi rendo conto, estremamente complessa, ma perché il tema delle neuroscienze è estremamente complesso. Però noi avremo modo di entrare in questioni più dettagliate con la professoressa Cattaneo, che però non fa la lezione giovedì perché è malata, e quindi farò io lezione sia giovedì che venerdì. Lei verrà il 12 aprile, quindi torneremo su alcune questioni tecniche delle neuroscienze e riprenderemo sempre questo tema in una poi delle mie lezioni di aprile. Dunque questa è veramente un'interessante e molto utile mappa delle questioni che entrano nell'ambito delle neuroscienze. Thank you very much.